On today's show, we dive back into our player capsule review series talking about Onyeka Okongwu. It is part 1 of 2, and it's coming to you right now.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1795 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening into Monday. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. And now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers get about $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started with that package. Also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast to make it your first listen each and every day. Please go ahead and subscribe to this podcast. Just search out Locked On Hawks on Apple, on Spotify, on Overcast. We're also on YouTube. Please like this video as you are watching it, and also please also subscribe to the podcast on that platform. We are back today with another episode in our player capsule review series, talking with Glen Willis of ATL 29 as the guest on the show. These are always fun conversations. It's part 1 coming to you right now. There'll also be a part 2 available in the same podcast feed of choice as soon as part 1 is over. And we're talking about Onyeka Okongwu on today's podcast, the soon-to-be 5th-year center for the Hawks. Pretty intriguing player moving forward for Atlanta. And that is sort of the headliner of today's podcast, and this is what we're going to focus on over these next 2 parts. Also want to encourage you to catch up on the recent episodes in the podcast feed. I talked to Brian Schroeder of NBA draft fame last week for a 2-part episode. I also did a mailbag podcast last week. We still been rolling along at least 3 episodes, sometimes 4 or 5 episodes per week. Even in the offseason, we're trying to give you all the content that you need on the Hawks. Also, I should say, Media Day is 3 weeks away as I'm recording this podcast on Sunday into Monday. So we're getting closer and closer to training camp, to the season, and ramping things up accordingly. So please stay tuned for part 2 when this one's over. And without any further delay, here we go with part 1, myself and Glen on Onyeka Okongwu. I'm joined once again by my friend Glen Willis as we continue our player capsule series with another member of the Hawks roster. A pretty intriguing one today, I would say. Glen, how are you?
Yeah, good. Good. Trying to get through the first week 1 as a Falcons fan is tough for the broader Falcons fan community, but we'll hope for a better week 2. But yeah, I mean, fall's here. Fall's my favorite season, so trying to be excited about that.
I was about to bring that up too. Sometimes I will try to hold these a little longer, so I try to make them a little more evergreen. But this is going to go up pretty soon after we record it, so we can talk about the Falcons for 1 second. It was not a lot of fun for either of us.
No.
I'll say for people that don't know, the Hawks especially, and even the Braves, but most of the Hawks, like it's professional for me. Like I cover the team professionally, try to be a little bit less emotional. I'm still just a pure old fan of the Atlanta Falcons, and they drive me absolutely crazy each and every Sunday, and that happened today. So if you can sense the tension, it's because we're recording like at 5 o'clock right after the Falcons game. Just brutal stuff.
Yeah,
it happens.
Hoping that it'll get a little better every week. So.
That's right. All right, let's move on from that as quickly as humanly possible. I said before, we're going to get to Onyeka Okongwu today. A pretty interesting player. I didn't intentionally hold him until the very end. We do have a couple more of these still to come. Trae Young and Jalen Johnson are the big ones. We'll probably do something on Dyson Daniels along the way, even though he wasn't on the team last year. But Onyeka, interesting player, of course. People know him by now, but about to enter his 5th season. And interestingly, starting the 4-year extension that he signed last summer. Because that's what happens. You sign it a year in advance. He's 23 years old still. He'll be 24 in December. For reference, he's the same age as Vit Krejci, about a year older than Jalen Johnson, so still definitely on the upswing age-wise. And had a kind of an interesting year last year. We'll get into some of that stuff. But what is your current impression of Onyeka? Because we'll start broad as we always do on these, and we'll kind of drill down. But I find that my answer to this is different when I ask different people.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a tough one to answer, right? Because for a guy that was drafted where he was, typically you get a starting role or maybe a bigger role. He's had an opportunity to start here and there, injuries and things like that. But we just never seen him go, regularly against other teams starting center. And so it's hard for me to evaluate him in that way. I mean, I know we'll talk about what he does well, what he needs to do better, where he can grow and develop and things like that. And we'll talk about, is he actually going to start this year? But for me, the 3 things that I call out, number 1 is his touch is elite, right? And that's on even self-created shots, at the rim. It's really, really, really unique high-level touch that he has. You always ask yourself, how much of your offense do you want to run through that, your 5 creating for himself, right? That's a fair conversation to kind of work through potentially, but there's no doubt in my mind from a touch perspective, he's up there. And for his position, he's good ball handler. I don't know if I would say good passer yet. He's functional passer. But could that come along if he played with Trey more, if he was in short roll more, if he was, some of the things that he would get to do. And the big asterisk I have to kind of put on my evaluation is with him being on the roster with Clint this whole time, when he comes on the floor, they kind of stay in the Clint offensive template. That's the way I talk about it. And that, to me, limits what he can do with some of the skills he has that Clint doesn't have. So that's, for me, why this is kind of murky for me to say this is what he would be if he was playing 28 to 30 minutes a game as a starter with the starting unit with Trey most of those minutes or what have you. Because, if they do flip, and move him into the starting role, will the offensive template for the center position change to emphasize what he can do well? Because that's not at all the opportunity he's been given. They've let him take corner threes. That's one little kind of step, there. But for me, I think it's been tough for him to thrive and develop and grow in areas where he has skill that looks like it could be meaningful because he's been playing all of this time, in my view, in the Capella offensive template.
I definitely agree with that. And, one of the broad things, sometimes we would do this at the very end, but I think we probably should even do it now. It's just, I've been saying this a lot, whether you're here or not. Like, I think it's a very, very big year for Onyeka Okongwu. I think it's a big year for the team at the center position. And I don't mean that to say that's the emphasis of the team, but, we've done the whole bit. We won't do it again now about it's the shock of still having both Clint and Onyeka on the team. But if you're a new listener, like, it is very surprising if you would say on the night of the 2020 draft, if you said the Hawks will still have Capella and Okongwu on the team in September 2024, I would have laughed at you, candidly. I would have thought there was almost no chance of that happening, and it's still happening. And one of the things that I've said, and I'm not trying to put your words in your mouth because you may not agree with me, but something that I believe is that one of the reasons Onyeka and Clint are still here, and that Clint is still here, is Onyeka has not, in my view, and the way I've described it, like, forced his way into the role that the Hawks were hoping he would be in. Now, doesn't mean he's been bad, and we'll get into that. He's been fine. He's been pretty good. I do think that they probably would have thought he would have been a little bit better than this through 4 years. When you go back 4 years to the draft, for me, this is kind of a sidebar, but once you're 4 years in, like, I don't really care where you were drafted. It kind of matters on some level, you know what I mean? Like, pedigree-wise and extensions. But, like, once you're on a second contract, it doesn't really matter. But when you kind of look backwards, it does kind of, play the expectations. But I think he's been pretty good, but not, like, at any point has he kind of forced their hand. And also, they like Clint, and they think Clint's valuable. And we can purposely not talk about Clint as much as we maybe could. But you're right. They definitely have built more around Clint than Onyeka, and that is fair schematically. Part of that is out of necessity. Early on, it was because Clint was playing so well, and he was clearly the better player. The last year, maybe 2 years, it's more like, a little bit more of each thing where, like, you just kind of have to, Clint's less versatile than Onyeka, and Clint's playing more, and he's a veteran, and the rebounding, all those things. But I agree with you 100%. Like, it's been difficult to kind of evaluate Onyeka Okongwu. And one of the reasons I put it the way I did when I asked you is that around the league, people that don't watch every Hawks game have a really interesting, like, variance of opinion on Okongwu. It's like everyone thinks he's pretty good, but it's kind of like, what's going on there? Why hasn't he gotten the run? And that could be angled in different ways. It's like, what's wrong with him where the Hawks won't just give him the job? And also the other side of it's more pessimistic. I think this is where kind of a lot of fans are, candidly, is why are the Hawks still doing this with Clint Capella? Why won't they just give Okongwu the keys? And I think it's a combination of all those things. It's nuance. Nuance is, of course, bad for most content. People don't like to do nuance, but it really is a lot of, like, part A, part B, part C of, like, Onyeka's been pretty good, but never, like, dominant. And I feel like this is a big year to kind of tell the world, but also especially the Hawks, like, hey, is he your guy at center long-term or not? Because we know it's not going to be Clint very much longer. Even you and I as Clint advocates would probably acknowledge that Clint's going the wrong way age-wise. But it's basically a question of, do you bank on Onyeka Okongwu being your center long-term, or do you need a center long-term? That's a pretty interesting question. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, and you've heard me talk about them a lot in the past, and FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. But this time around, something a little bit different for you with FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game with YouTube TV and Sunday Ticket. All you have to have is a Google account and a credit form payment, and you can cancel anytime. When you get there, you will also know that FanDuel Sportsbook is really easy to use. They have also they're looking for across the sports betting space from over-unders to point spreads, money lines, player props, future bets, and much more. The app is really safe and secure at FanDuel. They cover the entire range of sports as well. That includes the NBA, of course. We talk about this podcast all the time. WNBA stuff. NFL is now in full swing. College football, MLB, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, boxing, MMA, and so many more sports beyond that. And now is an awesome time to sign up with folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. And the place to go is FanDuel.com to get started. One more time, just visit FanDuel.com and check out America's #1 sportsbook.
Yeah, it is. And I always kind of like to look back at the journey too. And I think the lack of coaching and organizational continuity is a factor for young players as well. Like, right. I mean, so the big story is, I know I've gone through this before, so I'll take it up a level and be briefer. You know, Lloyd Pierce wanted to play a bunch of different defensive schemes, right? Throw a lot of his teams, right? From drop to at the level to switching 1 through 4, red switching to 1 through, like, and the reason, and one of the reasons in my mind the Hawks took off and made that Eastern Conference Finals run was Nate just believed in simplifying the defense. And for the roster that the Hawks had, that was a big deal. Like, Gallo could play heavy minutes in the defense Nate was running because Clint just cleaned up everything inside. And that was a magical run. And Nate, you know, even though I have other criticisms of him, he had a major contribution to that run. It deserves credit for how he just simplified the defense. We're running drop. We're running a basic drop scheme. It's going to be the same thing every single game. We're going to lean on Clint. We're going to flow ball handlers to Clint. And that was there, right? And then, you know, we got to Quinn, and you know, Quinn last season was a lot at the level, which wasn't, you know, always great for Clint. So I feel like as a young player, Nate simplifying the defense helped Clint. Like, I mean, Clint was Onyeka was impactful in the Philadelphia series at times, defending Onyeka, because what was being asked of him was simplified. Right. And now suddenly we fast forward to this year, don't really know. I don't know what to expect schematically. You know, they're going to lean more into some of Onyeka's versatility, being able to kind of play on the perimeter, switch, you know, things like that, or not. And of course, a big part of that is when you have, you know, when you're challenged at the point of attack, you need to prioritize rebounding and rim protection. And that's what Clint has had oodles of his whole career. You know, now with more, we talked about it with all these capsules, and we talked about roster changes. Now, hopefully, having a more confident kind of group of players that can defend at point of attack, does that simplify things for Onyeka in a different way and give him a chance to kind of be put in a spot to be asked to do things that he can be successful with? I think it's hard for us. I mean, I think people forget how young he was when he came to the league too. Super, super, super young when he came to the league, and so for me to, you know, young players that go through, you know, constant coaching changes and constant scheme changes and constant philosophy change, it's hard. And I think for presenters, it's hard, maybe harder for them than guys at any other position. And so that's a big part of how we got to where he is today. It's a contextual point that I think I don't necessarily give Onyeka a pass or give him more credit, or what. I think it's just an important lens to have when you're kind of looking at who he is today.
Yeah, and we could move on. I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork a little bit on that. And also, it's worth saying, is I think this kind of gets brushed off too. He actually has played more minutes per game successively in each of his 4 seasons. Last year, he actually averaged a career high in minutes, about 25.5 minutes per game, that's for a lot of teams starter minutes, not high starter minutes. Like, there's this, especially at center. Center's a different position than a lot of really any other position, where you have this group of, well, I won't name a number, but a small group of players. It's like playing 35 minutes a game, and they're generally stars or star level players. Yeah. And then a lot of other centers, starting centers, I've used in quotes, are not playing 30 plus minutes. They're playing in that 28-ish minute range. Onyeka, again, averaged 25.5 minutes a game last year. A lot of starting centers play in that range of minutes. Now, part of that is that when Clint sits, and Clint's unavailable, Onyeka's playing 35 minutes in those games. But even on certain nights, and you know this, we monitored it throughout the season, there were several games last year where Onyeka played more than Clint. and that was not out of the ordinary. Clint still played more on a regular basis. He started, but there were many nights when they go back to Okongwu, matchup wise, he was just playing better, etc., where he ended up playing more minutes. And I think that even if, as we'll probably circle back to this, I'm sure we will later on, even if Okongwu starts the first game of the season this year, I don't know if he's going to play more minutes per game than he did last year. You know what I mean? It might just be a little bit more of a tweak as like how he plays and who he plays with. You mentioned before the Trey thing. He actually played, I think, his highest percentage of minutes ever with Trey last year. He played about 60% of his minutes with Trey. Now, that's not a lot compared to like where Clint is, but that's more than he had been playing with Trey. He used to be almost exclusively not with Trey, because they were heavily, and I think with reason, they were tying Trey to Clint on both sides of the floor. It made sense on both sides of the floor, both to help Trey and to help Clint. We've seen more on Onyeka along the way. Other thing I want to make sure we get to before we get into like his skill development stuff is there is a question out there of like how durable he can be. And I don't use the injury prone word unless you have huge evidence of that. And I still probably wouldn't use it now, but he's only played more than 55 games once in 4 seasons. Now he's usually in that 50-ish game. It's 50, 48, and 55 in 3 of those 4 seasons. He played 80 games in his 3rd season. But even now, as going into the summer, last year he played 53 of the first 54 games. He was really healthy last year until he wasn't. He went down around Valentine's Day, had basically played 2 games after that and wasn't healthy when he came back. And even going into the summer, he had this non-surgical procedure on April 9th for the toe injury that he had. Originally, it was like a 4-week reevaluation timetable. I saw Nick at Summer League. I talked to him for a second. He wasn't even 100% healthy at Summer League, and that was 3 months later. So all indications are he's going to be ready for camp. So I'm not trying to sound the alarm on that, but he didn't even have a full summer this summer. So like, where do you stand on that? Because that's a question I get a lot from people. Like, is he ever going to stay healthy? I'm like, it can kind of be overblown and undercovered because he's not been totally gone. He's been out there, but he's not been a full season player other than once in the first 4 years.
I mean, for the position, it's so important because having stability as who is anchoring your defense, who is keeping everyone connected, who's communicating, all that sort of stuff is critical. It's hard when you have changes like that. It's to borrow a second of football talk again. It's like I played quarterback in high school, right? And for me, I think like if a team loses their center, like a professional team or college team loses their center, it may be even more impactful than their quarterback because of all the communication that happens on a line of scrimmage, typically with the center, right? And funny, it's the same position that call it the same position there. But for me, when you have a lack of continuity around who's playing what minutes, who's playing where in the rotation, who's playing with who, and things like that, it's hard. And so when the guy misses a month, and if you're only too deep, that's where last year, I mean, Bruno being available, Bruno's not. We covered him in a previous capsule, but Bruno's a good third center, right? And he's maybe depending on the situation, a passable second center, at times, But one of the reasons that they almost made the play-in was that they didn't have this massive drop-off with their third centers that a lot of teams would, right? And Bruno, we talked about him, and he has flaws and things like that. But for me, it's when Hawks fans ask, why is Clint Capella still on this roster? One reason might be is, do we need to be prepared to, play without Onyeka for a month again, or whatever it might be? Because, apart from Trey, maybe we put Dyson because of how impactful we expect him to. I mean, the center position is really where you take a huge setback defensively if you're playing a second and then a third guy as opposed to a first and a second guy. It's a pretty big drop off there. Yeah. So I think you have to factor it into your roster building. Do I ding him for being injury? I don't want to say injury prone. Some of them have been a little bit freakish, but it's been a pattern. But it's calling a pattern. I think it's fair.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a factor for how you build your roster, and I think that's why. Maybe Nance makes sense to have on the roster potentially, or, I don't know if they'll carry 4 when we get to the season or not with Zeller, but Clint's missed some time. Clint's getting older, and Onyeka's missed some time. So you probably want a third guy that you don't worry about rolling out there in any given situation. So I think it matters.
Today's show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and what's something that you would love to learn? As an adult, do you have to make time to learn new things as often as you would like to, or was that lost somewhere in your childhood? It's great to have curiosity. You can seek it out with the folks at BetterHelp. Therapy can be helpful for everyone, including myself, and it can really help you focus on what you want instead of what others might happen to have around you in your life. That helps you to start living your best life. You can learn positive coping skills, how to set better boundaries, and so many more things. I know I have my own stresses that I deal with on a regular basis, and we can also benefit from getting things off our chest. If you're thinking about starting therapy at all, give BetterHelp a try right now. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible to your schedule. That's a big part for me. If you're huge, like navigating time crunches, like I often am in my everyday life, that convenience and flexibility is huge. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time if you want to for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with the folks at BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month with BetterHelp. One more time, that place to visit is BetterHelp. That's better, H-E-L-P, BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. One of the reasons I brought that up is not to pick on Onyeka. It's just good context. And it also plays into one of the, I guess I'll use the word stereotype of Onyeka as the small center. Like, he doesn't have size that you want at that position. There is always
you also hear not a center. You'll see that.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's always a contention of people that just cannot accept that he's a center just based on exclusively only his height. And we won't argue with them today, but he is a center and always has been a center, whether people like it or not. But I think that maybe that plays into some of it too. I'm not a scientist. I don't know this stuff perfectly, but it's logical to me that if you are smaller, you might have to, you might get banged around a little bit more, and maybe that contributes to injury stuff. I don't know. It is what it is, but he hasn't been more than a 55-game player in 3 of his first 4 seasons, and that's the plain reality of it. And maybe that is part of it. And we'll probably get to Nance a little bit in the future, but Nance is way too good to be a third center. That's one of the questions about his roster right now. He's the most overqualified third center in the history of the NBA, probably. But
yes.
If he's your third center, that's a great luxury to have. I'm not saying that's a great roster building situation, but he's really, really good at that. So he's even better, much better than Bruno. All respect to Bruno. Larry Nance is much better. Anyway, okay, dealer's choice. Do you want to do the offense first or the defense first? I didn't ask you.
Let's do defense first. And the offense is really fun. I mean, you know me, I love talking about defense, but with him, it's the offense. He's a more unique offensive player than he is a defensive player. So I agree.
I almost started with the defense that I thought I might just ask you, but I thought you also might say defense. And part of this is also not everything is about Clint versus Onyeka, but it also is interesting to kind of talk about where the Hawks are with both guys. And while Onyeka is a prospect, I would say, and there have been really good flashes along the way. As a prospect, he was really defensively really, really impressive. I love his defense coming out of USC. You mentioned earlier, he said, great flashes against Embiid. He's been great against Giannis at times. He's been their kind of X factory guy in certain matchups defensively. I would also say, and have also said, that Clint has been the better defender for full seasons in each of the first 4 seasons that they've been together. That's my opinion. And also, this is only one metric, but EPM, which is one I like the most of the all-in-ones, really hated Onyeka's defense last year. And I'm not really sure why, but they're really low on it. And I personally didn't love it last year either. I don't think he was bad defensively, but good way to kind of jump in there is the team was better with Capella than Okongwu defensively. On offense, it was the other way, which is not surprising. But just defensively, what do you think about Onyeka right now? Because I feel like it's not a problem, but it maybe isn't the strength that I thought it might have been a couple years ago going into year 5. That's kind of broad on purpose, but how are you feeling about Onyeka's defense as a permanent, defensive anchor at center?
Yeah. So for me, he the baseline stuff. He's pretty solid at that. Pretty good at that stuff, right? I mean, he communicates, and and he drives connectivity across the unit and things like that. But it's just you kind of look at, well, where does he struggle? And it's go back to the point of attack defense. He is a smaller center in that way. And so if there's a big wing coming right downhill right at him, he has less to throw. I mean, he's not like Brook Lopez that can wall up at almost 9 feet, standing reach, and or maybe even more than that. But that's not who he is, right? I like that you called out the matchups with Giannis and other guys. Giannis, it's not going to, pull up a 15-foot mid-range shot. He's going to try to get to the rim. And what Onyeka has been exceptional at times is kind of walling off guys that are guys with limited skill for their size. Giannis isn't some super crafty guy. Giannis is awesome, but when it comes to like a flashy dribble or some tricky kind of, Giannis is trying to get through if he can't get to the rim, he's going to try to get to a step through. Right. That's what Embiid does now too, tries to get to the rim or get to his step through, draw a foul and things like that. And Onyeka has been good at kind of stepping up and walling off guys like that. But for me, when you think about that, you're like, well, sometimes he needs to play power forward on defense to get that matchup, right? If it's Lopez at the 5 and Giannis at the 4, do you play Jalen on Brook Lopez, for example? So for me, to lean into his defensive strengths, there needs to be some versatility built at the 3, 4, 5, mostly at the 4 and the 5, to kind of get him doing the things that his skill allows him to do. And again, on defense, he's been playing mostly in the Capella template, where it's like, protect the rim, try to rebound, and we'll talk about his rebounding. But for me, I think his ability to kind of work to move, to navigate space away from the rim, and to contain some of the bigger guys who try to overwhelm you with length and size, and one step bursts, and things like that. He's good at that stuff. He hasn't had a chance to do that a lot, right? In that Bucks series, he did a good bit, against that, but you go back to the next year and the last few years, and it's more of traditional rim bound, paint bound center, and which, like I said, it's not like he's bad at that, but it's definitely not letting him lean into his strengths.
For sure. And, I pulled some numbers, and part of this, I gave this caveat with Clint, and I know you did, like, the point of attack, and for me, has been the bigger problem than anything going on near the rim the last couple of years defensively. It's not even a question in my mind, but that also applies to Onyeka, almost more so, because especially if you're asking Onyeka to play more conservatively, closer to the rim, etc., he's less equipped to do that, which might lead to worse numbers for him in particular, of some of those, like, field goal percentage out of the rim. For instance, he allowed like 60% last year at the rim, which isn't awful, but isn't particularly good for a center. Clint was 55%, which is above average, not elite, but pretty good. That's one metric, and there's some noise in there, but that's worth noting. Like, I actually thought it was interesting, and I didn't even realize this in full until I was asked about it by Josh Lloyd, actually, my colleague at Locked On Fantasy Basketball, did his show, and he pointed this out to me, and I went and did some digging on it. Onyeka's block rate and steal rate were way down last year. I knew they were down, but I didn't know how much until I looked, and they were way down. And I wonder if that was someone on purpose to get his fouls down, because Onyeka has famously been a very, very high foul player. His fouls were down last year. They were still more than you would want, but they were in a more reasonable range than they've been previously. Maybe that's because he gambled less, took less shot block opportunities, et cetera, steal opportunities. You got to find the middle ground there. And yeah, there's always, this is kind of almost an aside, but there's always been this thought too in my mind where you certainly would not ideally pair someone like Trae Young with Onyeka Okongwu's defensive strengths in my mind. I think Trae and his weaknesses, as much as they are probably overvalued by a lot of people, he has them. He's small. He's not very good defensively, etc. You would maybe want to ideally have Trae with someone like in a more traditional mold, a la like prime Clint, or pick your guy. Rudy Gobert is obviously the A template of this from a few years ago. But I don't think you would ideally, in a perfect world, pair Trae with Onyeka, because you can't switch as much with Trae, all those things. You're switching more 2 through 5 and 1 through 5, etc. I'm not saying that's it, but the combination of bad point of attack defense and the scheme versatility or lack thereof that the Hawks have used the last couple of years has not done Onyeka any favors, which is what I would say.
I mean, when I think about why, especially the block rate, being down, it's funny the things that bother you that you recall from prior, like when they played the Mexico City game against Orlando pretty early in the season, right? And I think it was on NBA TV, and I can't remember the name of the two gentlemen who were covering the game, and they're professional broadcasters, but they were like, Clint Capella's block numbers are that way down. And I'm like, he's playing at the level like all the time,
right?
So exactly. he's playing away from the right now, and on top of that, Quinn expected Clint and Onyeka, his centers, to close out on 3-point shooters, right? I mean, Quinn believes in limiting opponent 3-point volume as much as he can. And so I think there is a lot of scheme there. I do think he has to be a little bit more specific in his technique protecting the rim, just because he's a little bit smaller. He has to be there a half step earlier, make sure he's in exactly the right spot, not getting caught too deep, under the rim or right in front of the rim and things like that. But for me, a lot of it was just what Quinn was trying to get them to do and control opponent 3-point volume. Because, I mean, Clint was closing out, Onyeka was closing out, Bruno was closing out all the time. And that created massive rebounding issues. That there were times in the fourth quarter it felt like the Hawks couldn't get a defensive rebound. They're down 6 or 8 points with 5 minutes to go and can't get a defensive rebound to save their life. And so for me, I think a lot of it was scheme. And I know people want to scream at Quinn. I think Quinn had nearly an impossible job trying to manage the team defensively last year. Yes. If you want to say, Glenn, you're going too easy on him, that's fine. I won't have an argument with you on that. He's a professional, experienced head coach. This year I'm looking forward to that. But for me, I just think a lot of that was scheme, and that was true of Clint and Onyeka. And across the second half of the season, I felt like, especially when the rotation got shorter, they had a bunch of injuries, things like that, that Quinn did kind of tone down a lot of that and just said, we're going to just, pack the paint and do our best, And
they were some of
the numbers came back, but you're right. They were small at the 3 and the 4, like when Jalen was down and Hunter was down, and so it's just impossible.
Right. And, we could probably talk about this even more if you want to, but being so small hurt a lot of things. That's one of the things Quinn kept saying. One of the few times he's candid was about how small they were and how he didn't really like that. But that in particular impacts Okongwu, who's already small in his own right. So there's one of the many reasons why Jalen and Okongwu make so much sense together is that Jalen's got great size. And you compare him, he's a great rebounder at the 4 in particular. Yep. Those guys make perfect sense together on both ends of the floor, but especially on defense to help him. But if you're trying to play Okongwu with someone like even Sadiq, as bulky as he is, or Hunter at the 4, like you just don't have enough rebounding. You don't have enough size. Second rim protection, like you're not going to get that from Hunter or Bay or any of these guys. Like you need someone else that can help on the other side of the floor. We also saw this is a tiny sample size. I think like almost 10% of the possessions last year were at the 4 next to Clint, which is the most he's ever played the 4 in his life. Part of that was necessity, as we just talked about all the injuries. Like, and Quinn was very open about that. Like they did it, I think, definitely out of necessity many times. A couple times it was matchup related, where they go to it defensively, because it did work on defense. On offense, it didn't really work, which is not surprising. That's what you expect to play 2 centers together. But there's some noise in some of this stuff too, because Okongwu did actually play some 4 last year. A little bit, but not a lot, but a little bit. All right, that's it for part 1 of this 2-part conversation with myself and Glen Willis, talking all things on Onyeka Okongwu and the intriguing parts of his game, positives, negatives, etc. Part 2 should be available right now in the same podcast feed, so go ahead and subscribe to this podcast anywhere you are listening to it right now, on Apple, on Spotify. We're also on YouTube. Please like this video and subscribe over there as well. Follow the show on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there as well at BT Rowland, and follow my non-podcast work at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I appreciate everybody listening to the podcast. Again, one more time, stay tuned for part 2 right now on your same podcast feed, and we'll see you all next time.